I'm a lawyer, and our law firm does both law and policy. That's the name Law and Resource Planning Associates. And so I was asked to look at 4 questions and produce a report and then present that to the community. Present it to the community. Is that better? To the board and to the community, and I've done that. Along with my associates, we retained a certified public accountant firm to look at the finances. We were given complete access to all the financial records of the IID, which we evaluated. They were very cooperative in that regard. We also were given any documents we needed to evaluate the quantification settlement agreement, which was the focus of our study, and we came up with some recommendations. And so I indicated to, I first of all, rather than rely on everything I say, I would recommend that you look at this report, A Critical Path Forward, QSA Plan B, relating to the water rights and preserving the water rights, the environment, and the community. It's at the IID offices, and it's online, and I think it'll be readily available for everyone. But I think it's really, for me, I have worked on the Colorado for many years. The dean at Stanford Law School was a personal friend of mine, and his name was Charles Myers, and he passed away a few years back, but he was the special master in Arizona versus California. He was a clerk for the special master, Mr. Rifkin. And so I've been working on this a long time, and I'm somewhat familiar with the Colorado Basin states and the issues over the Colorado. And I was always intrigued how it was that a place like the Imperial Valley could have the quantity of water rights it has, namely almost 3/4 of the total supply of Colorado, from the supply from the Colorado River. And now I know the answer to that, and it's in a pretty heroic story. As you know, probably most of you know, we live in the western United States. They follow the doctrine of prior appropriation. That doctrine was designed to reward people, those people who were willing to go out and put in the effort to put water to beneficial use. Fortunately, starting before the turn of the last century and up through 1910 and continuing onward, the people of the pioneers in this valley put to beneficial use well over 3 million acre-feet of water when no one else was using any on the Colorado. And as a result, when there was an adjudication, both by the Boulder Canyon Project Act, which was a congressional apportionment, and the adjudication of the Colorado River Compact, the court found that there were substantial present perfected rights in the valley that are here and can't be taken away and belong in the valley because of the fact of beneficial use. So that's the first point. You have a remarkable asset here of these present perfected water rights and then some with early priorities, tremendously valuable thing. And they're here not because of what anyone has done here, but because what the pioneers did, but they continue to belong to the valley because they've been placed in beneficial use since that time, and they've been ratified not only by the U.S. Supreme Court, but also by a number of agreements and federal laws. The problem with owning something like this is that when you have the most valuable asset in the region, other people want to take it from you. And in the state of California, the development has been rapid along the urban coast. California ultimately developed a use out of the Colorado of around 5.2 million acre-feet, but their apportionment under the law of the river, or the Boulder Canyon Project Act, was only 4.4 million acre-feet. And that was fine for a while because there wasn't the development in Las Vegas. There wasn't, the Central Arizona Project was not constructed. There were other reasons why there was water available out of the Colorado, and we had some very flush years. But suddenly, as the true average quantity of water became available, 7.5 million acre-feet, and the basin demand, both in the upper basin and in Nevada and Arizona, increased, ultimately, it was clear that the state of California was using more than it had a right to. there were a couple of changes in the federal government in which people from Colorado, the Secretary of the Interior was from Colorado. She was an Upper Basin State person. There were some very powerful politicians. There were others who began to put pressure on the California major water users, the Metropolitan Water District, San Diego, and the major urban interests, and said, you've got to bring it into line. So the choices were fairly limited. You could bring the water down from Northern California, but from best I can tell, there are really two states. There's the state of North California, and there's the state of South California. That was a very difficult political thing to accomplish, plus there were some collateral environmental consequences that were already triggered in the Bay Delta region. So that was not really a viable option. But there was another one, and that was to begin to take the water from the major water user with the senior priority, and that would be the Imperial Valley and the Imperial Irrigation District. So the political pressure mounted to get that water moved from the IID over to the urban coast. It's the natural political process, and the coalition was huge. It was the Metropolitan Water District. It was 20 million people on the coast. It was the Bureau of Reclamation. It was the Upper Basin states. IID was pretty much the Lone Ranger in saying, no, we want to resist this. And they did resist as long as they could. But to make a long story short, as with all these political mismatches, it was essential that at some point the IID do something to preserve its water rights while at the same time acquiescing to some of the political pressure. The result of that was something called the Quantification Settlement Agreement. It's actually over 30 agreements, and it's prolix, and it involves Coachella, it involves Metropolitan Water District, it involves San Diego mostly, but the result of this complex of agreements was that in exchange for engaging in conservation within this valley, the water would be moved over, and this is a great oversimplification, but moved to the urban coast. The first agreement didn't involve it. It was more of a direct. It was just really a strong arm in which MWD simply came in and said, we'll do things, and in exchange, by God, you'll conserve. The second one was at least a negotiated agreement, the QSA, but the QSA had two major premises that allowed it to happen. One was that when you begin to remove water from a region, from any basin, it has necessarily, you no longer get the return flows, you no longer get the runoff from irrigation, and the net effect would be to dramatically affect an already declining Salton Sea. So the byproduct of the QSA and the natural decline of the Salton Sea meant that there were going to be significant environmental quality problems, significant effects on birds, significant effect on the region as a whole. That was one. So the first thing was that had to be fixed. And the answer back in 2003 when they signed this agreement was, that's not a problem. California's got the third largest GDP in the Western Hemisphere. Everybody gets rich here selling their houses to each other. We've never had any boom and bust like in the 49ers and gold, and point being that everybody believed there was unlimited money, so the state of California simply said, don't worry, we'll cover the cost of the Salton Sea, and we will also cover the excess mitigation costs. We can do that. If you'll sign it, we can do that. Okay, that's one requirement. The second requirement was that there has to actually be conservation so that there's no net loss of farmland. If you can farm the same quantity of land, and if you can use less water, and if someone will pay for that conservation and it's practical, then it'll work. But you have to have both of those things work for you for this particular thing, to the QSA, to be functional. So they negotiated, they came up with a price, they came up with a timetable. Initially, they were going to fallow land until 2017, and they're going to start in 2013 doing conservation, and so the plan was in place. But like all things, Agreements, with the exception of the United States Constitution, the times outstrip and the circumstances outstrip the best intentions of the parties. And in this case, two things happened that were significant. One, there was litigation involving the question whether they could actually force the state of California under the QSA to support and pay for all the excess environmental mitigation costs, because the IID's position was it shouldn't be visited on the farmers. They're simply transferring the water. It at a minimum ought to be paid by the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries, San Diego, MWD, they didn't want to pay, but California had stepped up to the plate. But the Court of Appeal of California said, no, you can't force them to pay. That would be their position was it was never the intent of the parties to cause the state to have to pay. They would only pay if the legislature appropriated the money. Well, that's sort of a Pyrrhic promise, because at the time, that actually might have been the intent. No one will ever know. But the legislature of California can't even pay teachers, much less come up with money to pay for all the environmental externalities associated with the Salton Sea. So the first major change that we came up with is that the capacity of the state, qua state as a whole, to cover the effects on the Imperial Valley is no longer there. It's just not a realistic expectation. Even the IID has requested in a petition to change some of the plans, because there's why keep there. One of the proposals was to keep putting water in the Salton Sea rather than use it for other purposes. The IID pointed out in a petition before the State Water Resources Control Board, unless there's a real plan to save the sea, you're just wasting the water. Let's at least do something else with it. So there's a reality out there that environmental consequence exists, and it needs to be dealt with. The other thing that we came across and that concerned us a great deal was that the major premise of the QSA was that it would be a win-win. That is to say, the farmers would win because they could engage in conservation, and the coast would win because they'd get the benefits of that frugal behavior. Unfortunately, most theoretical studies of farmers saving water, they don't actually find out what the farmers can do. And so the second problem we face, that we've concluded that needs to be faced here, is that there needs to be a legitimate methodology for figuring out how to make this conservation work. And once that analysis is complete, it needs to be implemented as soon as possible. And I have pointed out, and I think I'm right, or at least I agree with myself on this point, that right now there is a third change in circumstance. That is, when they signed the QSA in 2003, everybody believed that the economy of California would be ever expanding, that there would be no need for new revenues, that they could easily pay for things, and the real estate market and derivatives and all of that sure money would be there to carry the tax burden. Even though irrigation is a $38 billion industry and $1 billion in this valley, small potatoes, those farmers, we'll squeeze them, we don't care. Now, in my opinion, irrigation communities, the small irrigation communities like this one, are on the high ground, because sustainable agriculture is the one sure thing that seems to be working. If you don't believe that, go to Nebraska and try to buy an acre of farmland. Everybody is turning their eyes towards sustainable things. And properly done, farming is a sustainable community economic base. If you can pay the environmental externalities, which you can if you're doing something rational, then you have the high ground there. So what our recommendations are, in summary, our recommendations were the following. First, we believe that it's essential, or our study says, it's essential to acknowledge the incredible difficulty there is going to be on the environmental side and work with the community, with the air quality people, because the exposure of playas and the amount of dust pollution and heavy metals out there, and I'm very familiar with that, that can be incredibly difficult for everyone's quality of life. So my first recommendation is, even though in the past people have been involved in litigation, the IID versus the county air quality people, you really need to bring those two interests together. The argument is made, well, why do you care? There's a statute that says the maximum liability is X, right? So it's capped. So if you cause some problems, why do you care? The answer is you care because you live here. It's like a person who's involved in an automobile accident and they suffer multiple millions of dollars of damage, and their lawyer comes in and talks to them and says, oh, don't worry about that. Your liability is capped at $300,000, except the liability is to himself. A cap on damages doesn't relieve the obligation to protect the place where you live. So that's why I'm saying there is no legal fix for this. It's a cooperative effort that we conclude needs to be worked on and quickly. Thank you. The second thing that we concluded was this: when you get an agreement of the magnitude of the quantification settlement agreement, the good news is it quantifies in some ways the quantity of water rights and solves a problem there. It's good. While it sets it at 3.1 million, it nevertheless deducts it back down to about 2.6 some million. But it does at least give you some parameters. But it's just an agreement. Sometimes agreements like this to sell part of your assets over a period of time to somebody else, sometimes that can be the tail wagging the dog. So our second conclusion is that the QSA, while a significant agreement was made by the board, it was made by political institutions, it can be changed by political institutions. And so you need to look at it that way, not as the charter of the IID, because the IID's charter is really straightforward. It's to keep the water rights in the valley, which are essential for the economy of this area, as long as possible, and keep them in beneficial use. It's to serve as a trustee for the environment as use of those rights relate to the actual degradation of the environment and hopefully make it better. The third is to ensure that the sum of net benefits from the activity provides an economic benefit to everybody in the area, the secondary benefits, because it's a critical economic engine. And I think the fourth one, having worked in lots of different places, people don't realize sometimes. Let me give you an example. We have a client in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We represent Irrigation District, a big one, not this big, but a big one. But we also represent Intel Corporation. Intel Corporation is only there because there were water rights that could be used to sustain the substantial amount of water they need. The water rights were still there and not in Texas, where they would like to take them, because they were sustained by ag. So as certain parts of the agricultural community wanted to change, there was something there for, just like you have a workforce, you need the water rights, you need the physical water, and if it's somewhere else, that's where the industry goes. So it's really an integral part of the community in that way. So those were our four conclusions. The fifth one was more procedural. And we made a recommendation on this. Given the overall magnitude of the effects of this entire process, this QSA, and how it affects everyone here, we recommended that whenever in the future any decision is made regarding the operations vis-a-vis the QSA, whether it's legal or policy, that be made a completely public process in which, and you have an impact statement that's presented to the board and the community so people can understand that even though it's complex, it is actually understandable. And so that was our sort of final point, was that given all the importance of it, that there be greater transparency, and that you involve the community so they can hear and understand what's going on. Now, a critical component, other than the recommendations regarding the environment, that's the component of making sure that there's a method of conserving water, getting that done, and getting it done so that there's not an indictment by your competitors for the resource that you're not really trying. You know, it's my view that in any Western water law system, including in California, if you make the very best efforts you can and you put water to use reasonably and beneficially within the economic capacity to do so, that's all you have to do. You're not wasteful because you don't farm in a way that you go out of business, okay? But somewhere between having to farm in a way that you go out of business, which is not required, and not doing any conservation is sort of the limit. And Jesse and I have been talking about how we can work with the water conservation people, the farmers themselves, and others. You might want to talk a little bit about that effort, Jesse, and what sort of our goals in the conservation area, because we think that's a critical component of making this thing work.
Yeah, excuse me. On both the on-farm and on the system conservation, we believe that we have to, for instance, on-farm, be able to use the Water Conservation Advisory Board and ask you guys, I see a lot of you here, what is it that we can do, and you guys have to be able to tell us what it is that you can do to make it work. If we're just telling you this is what you have to do, it's not going to happen. So since I've come back here at the beginning of this year, we've made it a point to get the Water Conservation Advisory Board involved, and we have been talking about on-farm conservation. We're to the point where we need to, we're looking at two basic things, contracts with owners and contracts with tenants, and there's some legal issues there that we have to work out, but I think that the community has responded, and I think we're getting close to moving forward. I don't know, if we're going to end up getting any contracts or not, but we need to get going so that we can get started and find out if we can do it or not. It's the same thing on the system conservation. When I came back, there had been a lot of work done, but it had been done by a lot of our consultants to the point that our people didn't even really know what we were supposed to be doing. So there was a lot of resistance to doing some of the things that were proposed to be done. So we've taken that back and gotten our people involved to the point where they're making the decisions on what to do, and I think they own it now. So I think that we will make it happen. So again, I think if we do try to do those two things on those two fronts, on farm and system, is get the people that are going to be doing it involved, I think that we can make it work. And that's our plan.
I've been working with Jesse, and I met with some of the farmers earlier today and had a really good discussion with a lot of talented growers. And I found out that of the 400 farmers they identified, there are 400 different experts with 400 different opinions. And all of them are right. But I think this is doable. I really think it is doable. But to not participate in conservation, since that's the heart of the QSA, is a huge mistake. It puts you it's not the high ground. On the other hand, you really do have the high ground. This is the way I honestly believe it. I think if you are engaging in conservation, if you are producing good crops on a sustainable basis, if you're producing both hay, grains, and supporting feedlots and beef and vegetables in the wintertime, enough to supply almost the whole nation, that is the high ground. That is to say, I would even say, if let's look at the uses on the Colorado. I'm very happy with the fact that they can generate hydropower over the dam, and provide electricity. That's not consumptive. I also think that there are some very valuable uses for water in municipal uses, and people need water to drink. But in terms of value, I think one of the highest and best uses of water is going on right here, because you're engaging in sustainable agriculture. And contrary to the perpetual belief that you didn't need sustainability, now we realize that you do need it, and what you're doing right here is annual sustainable food and fiber production. That is, in my view, one of the highest and best uses on the river. And the important thing is to get that out and get it said. And the way to do that is to engage in conservation, work with Jesse and myself, and then at the same time, at every forum in every place, make that point that this is one of the highest and best uses of the waters of the Colorado, and it's sustainable, and it should be perpetuated and supported, not attacked, because it doesn't support unlimited growth elsewhere where people probably shouldn't be living. So that's what little I know about it. We'd be glad to take questions. Geez, must have been persuasive. There's a question. I'll bring it over to him. Can you take him the mic? I'll get it if you... There you go.
My name is John Benson.
Hi, John.
Mars. Jesse knows me well, and we worked together years ago. And I totally agree with you that we need to renegotiate the QSA because it's unworkable, because that environmental part was very critical to the deal. My good friend Lloyd Allen said that, well, they had to do it, and when the state said we'll come up with the money, that kind of broke our back. We had to do it, and but I think it needs to be negotiated. I don't think that Mr. Carter, my friend, and Mr. Othias are the people to renegotiate it, because they have been defending it to the utmost for the last 10 years, and I think it's human nature says it's hard to do a 180 and come back and say, oh, but we've got to renegotiate. So I'd like to see us hire a new a renegotiator. I think Jesse's sitting next to one that I'd like to see hired, but I don't know if that's possible. But definitely that's part of the mix. We have to go ahead and tell, I don't think that San Diego cares, really too much what it costs, that within reason. They're buying desalinization plants for what, $2,400 an acre foot, and that's and the newspaper's saying we should be doing more of this. So I think that they have to have the water, and we can't take it back. We should understand that. We made the deal. We can't take the water back. We ought to get the money right and the environmental right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions?
It's dinner time.
And to go to the funeral too.
My name is Tom Mills. I've been involved in agriculture in Imperial Valley for 50 years in one way or another. I was on the first local entity board for what that was worth, so I got a pretty good look at what's going on. Looks to me like there's not much way you can stop us from having to reach the 200,000 acre foot transfer. But there is something I might ask a question, that our water has to be put to beneficial use. Are the people that receive the transferred water required to put it to beneficial use? The reason I ask that is there's hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water that's treated to a pretty high level that flow into the Pacific Ocean every day. And can you blend that into this program where they are required to use that water to beneficial use before they can come back over the 200,000 acre feet?
The answer is that they are certainly obligated to put it to beneficial use, and demonstrating their demand would be one of the things you'd talk about, and demand's changing. And I just think that, the term, one term is renegotiate. I think it's just really taking it piece by piece and just redoing the agreement so that it meets both sides' needs. I don't think it's necessarily, I think you might find in some cases that San Diego, as you point out, might have other sources of water. They may be obligated to do other things. But there are the common problem of the environment is really critical, that we fix that, and I think we can. And the board, I think, understands that. Your board understands that, and they got it, and they're going to get a chance next on the 18th to either approve our report and our recommendations or not, and we'll see what they think of those. But clearly that's true. And I think on the whole issue of conservation, that you're facing a huge complex political and economic question when you get down to conservation versus fallowing, because one way to make water is to fallow ground, and it's no longer. It doesn't come back usually, almost never. So you got that, but that's why you have a good board. You're going to have a good board there. You have a good board, and all these things have to come to them, and that's one of our recommendations. Is that when these choices are set out and made available to the public needs to have input. And this effort, which is really Board Member Hanks and Kevin, actually, and JP, everybody said that we should get out here and do this, but I think that's a first start, but it does really affect everyone's future, so they need to be involved in the decision making. Did you have Steve?
Yeah, it's Steve Benson, Brawley. I have a couple questions related to your report and some of the findings you came up with. You did point out a lot of important issues on the QSA, and as a farmer, putting in place some of these on-farm conservation programs, we've been waiting 10 years while fallowing's been going on. So we've been ready, and the document was set up such that we had to wait 10 years. We couldn't jump into it. But at the same time, it's a very quick ramp up over a certain number of years. And in the next 5 years, I think, or 7 years, fallowing will be over through 2017.
Right. And you're starting to ramp up on conservation requirements right now, and they go up very quickly. It's a very steep curve. It's going to require a huge amount of participation in the community, in the irrigation community.
Right. I think your report speaks of 80 to 90% participation, which when you have a 60% landowner base that lives out of the valley, it's hard to expect them to want to sign up for anything unless they see a benefit out of it.
That's a good point.
And I just wonder if there's enough provisions in the on-farm side to really work with farmers on a short-term basis, or, what's the ability for farmers to actively pursue on-farm conservation if they can't get their landowner to sign up?
Yeah. I guess my point on that, the question is, and it's a good one, is what about the fact that if you were a tenant farmer and you'd like to do some conservation things, just like best management practices, which don't involve capital investment, is it possible to go ahead, is it possible to participate? Isn't that your question?
Yeah.
If you don't have the landowner's approval. And that would, each lease would be different, but my guess is in almost most of the cases, if all you're doing is, if your lease is paid in full, if you're making no capital change, no physical change to the ground, and you're making no capital improvements that would decrease, and almost always it would increase if you did do them, I don't think, my view is, at that point, you ought to have the flexibility to try to work with the tenant farmer to do that and check out the lease, make sure you're not doing anything illegal. The second question would be, is that allowed under the QSA? That is to say, can you, having a contract with a tenant without going through the owner, because the QSA the QSA, specifically the QSA Water Transfer Agreement, talks about agreements with owners. But my view on that, as long as water is conserved, and if San Diego gets the water, why would they care? So long as you're producing conservation, you're conforming with basically the concept behind the document, and if they did care, find out why, and my guess is they would waive it, but the board could just be asked to go talk to them and fix that. But the most important thing is to get some solutions that work and get them now, because you don't want to be in a position of having other people say, see, the IID farmers won't conserve. They will conserve, but they can't lose money conserving, and it has to be practical and real. So that's the tension you have. But, well, like I said, we're on the high ground on so many issues, but if you don't conserve at all, then you're going to get the argument from those people who have what I consider to be lesser uses of water, arguing, pointing the finger at you, saying, see, you won't participate in your own contract. That's not a good thing. That was a good question.
Right, and then just based on your report, you talk about the $3.5 billion that's going towards the on-farm, but there's a very small margin. Just as you pointed out, there's really no room for error even on the farming side. We could spend $100, $200 an acre trying to conserve water, and the net back to us is only $100 to $200 an acre. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to justify that for other people that are barely making a profit margin of 5-10%. Yeah. To step out and do more that they don't know if they're going to get the payback. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask Jesse about that. I know that you guys have been, you recognize the risk involved in trying some of these things, and maybe early on there was concern about disproportionate, is it a rigid thing or can it be flexible? Now I think you're looking at it a different way, aren't you?
Yeah, originally when the contract was signed, it was envisioned, it was a very narrow view of conservation. Now that we're actually getting involved and we're talking about so many different things, we really need to look at that a little differently, because like you're talking about, I look at it as if a farmer if we can deal with whoever's growing that crop and just on a crop basis, and like Chuck says, if he calls it a best managed, in other words, just irrigate differently with sprinklers versus flood, for instance. That was never envisioned in the original QSA agreement. So that's why the contract says you have to deal with the landowner, because they were talking about making permanent changes to the infrastructure changes to the property. But when you're talking about irrigating differently or something like that, again, that was never envisioned, and I think that we got to look at that, and we are looking at it now. How can we make that happen? Because we never thought, it really wasn't thought of before.
And then could you just speak a little bit about the environmental assumptions that you made? Because in your report, there's a $1 billion shortfall at the end of the QSA.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone in this room wants to wait 30, 40 years to find out we owe someone $1 billion. There's some money being paid for mitigations along the way that is assuming the state's not going to step in.
Yes. Yeah. What we did in our report is we currently looked at the money allocation system that's in place at the Imperial Irrigation District. And right now, because there's much more money coming in for water sales than there is expenditures, because you won't start conservation. In fact, I was talking to Tina, who was Shields, who worked on this for many years, and she was expressing her frustration that they couldn't start the conservation because the conservation has a direct effect on the environmental consequences, so they were forced to be limited to fallowing. Had they been able to get a head start, we would be further ahead, but they were stuck. But the point is, there's revenue coming in, and much of that revenue is being used to pay water department expenses and other costs, right? And so we looked at that, and unless there's going to be a dramatic rate increase or something changes, we decided you had to put on the expense side of the column the amount that you're going to use some quantity to subsidize or to pay for overall operations, because it's a benefit to everybody to get this revenue coming in and make the IID financially solvent. So that goes on the expense side. Another thing that goes on the expense side, you have all this money coming in, right? That's a great thing on the revenue side, but we calculated when the state was going to be paying all the mitigation costs, we calculated a cost for that. now, and we assumed that that mitigation was necessary in order to protect the valley. But the cap for the obligations of the partners is $133 million. So there's a huge gap between the amount that was capped to pay by us and everyone, and the partners, and how much it's going to really cost. So we took our own estimates when everybody thought the state was going to pay, and we put those in the expense column. And finally, we thought, well, you can't just let the Salton Sea die. You're going to spend a little bit on that. But when you add in those three items and compare it to the revenues that are coming in, you find that, in fact, at the end, there could be a huge liability at the end. Now, one could argue, well, you can't assume that because we may not, the costs, the environmental costs may not be that much. Yeah, they may not be, but they might be more. The engineering costs may not go up as much as we say. That's true. They might go up more. So all I'm saying is even though it's a huge amount of money and it's great to have that revenue, on the margin, there's not a huge room for error. You look at any public sector project, they're going to build in a much greater margin, for change in the development of the project, and it isn't there. That's not a criticism, that's just a fact. So that's my only point about that is, then you have to recognize it and deal with it, and you can, and the board gets it. The board fully understands what we said.
Have any questions? Mr. Ramos.
Good evening. My name is Tony Ramos. I'm a Central resident. How long ago, Mr. DeMars, did the QSA get passed?
Pardon me?
How long ago, how many years ago did it get passed?
Well, 2003 is when the QSA was...
2003, and I think you were the CEO then, right?
General manager, yeah.
Who?
Yes.
Anyway, my thing was I was there when it got passed.
Okay.
And it was a 3-2 vote with Mr. Allen, Lord Allen, and Maldonado and Bruce Kuhn voting for it. I was there, and it was passed hastily because that's when I started getting involved in politics, more so in issues with water, because without water, this valley doesn't exist. I mean, there's no valley, and I couldn't figure out how we were transferring water from the desert to the western cities when they had other issues that weren't our issues, And like you said, Mr. Mars, a week ago, the QSA was kindly said by you, superimposed on us, and it's almost like saying it was forced down our throat, really.
Right.
And to me, people have benefited from that. I'm not a farmer. I used to be a probation officer for 35 years, so as far as me working and knowing about it, I know more about it when I used to work for the farmer before I went in the Air Force back in 1966. And my point is that people like myself I do know more about it because I've been coming here since the time of the QSA got passed. So I know a little more about it. And sometimes I get in people's face, but I don't mean to get in people's face. I just speak out because this is the way I feel. I feel the QSA then was bad. It was forced upon us. People benefited from it. Bruce Kuhn, back then, I don't mean to sound political here, but Bruce Kuhn voted for it, and he benefited from it. He got over $200 in monies that he did for landscape that he said that he lost. It's okay, but that's how it happened. And my concern is that now I'm for the QSA, because the state's not going to help us with helping us with the Salton Sea. They've said they don't have no money. Whatever happens with the QSA is going to be forced back on the IID, and guess who the IID is? Us, the ratepayers. Us, the ratepayers, may be forced to deal with everything when we didn't ask for this. And what happened was that people that were smart, they say, you know what? There's Imperial Valley where they get more water from all the 7 western states. That's true, right? We get more water a lot from all the 7 states. Why don't we go and get their water and we'll say this way, and we'll plan it this way and that way, and that's what happened. Real simple, that's what happened. And now I'm afraid that with the following and people getting monies for that, people have benefited from that, except us, the ratepayers that are non-agriculture. And it's okay, the people that do agriculture, this is the bowl where they grow vegetables, where they grow crops. We serve a lot of the country, if not a lot of nations, the world. It's okay, and it's an agricultural country. But at the same time, let's not forget that the QSA didn't benefit the people that live here, most of 95%, it benefited the farming community. And unfortunately, you know, as I see this, the more water is transferred between the time that the QSA passed and now, it's less water for the Imperial Valley. I came up there back then and I had a gallon of water, which was half full. That represented what it would do to our agricultural community here then. It's half full then. Now I see it almost a quarter full. And people tell me, don't talk about Owens Valley, what happened over there. But what happened in Owens Valley, people were forced, really forced. That's when the government, even the president, took the land, they made the aqueduct, and they forced the people to sell their water. There's nothing there now. Now they're doing legally. They're doing it legally, and they're being cunning about it. And to me, people like me have to speak about this. And nothing against the agricultural community or their farmers, because we need them. They support our agriculture and the people here, because what they support is also a job for the people that work in the field. So to me, you know, I take my hats up to them, but the QSA benefited more the people that are already established here, and not the ratepayers like myself.
Anybody else? Howard?
Yeah, Howard Elmore. When you talk about on-farm conservation, how do we qualify that? I've heard of different ways of saying, okay, an acre would be get so much water, but is that anywhere in your discussions on-farm, or what the farm would get, so we know what we're saving?
Yes. How are you talking about baseline? In other words, what are we going to measure your conservation against? Is that the question? Yeah, the way that they're talking about now is that it would be based upon the particular crop that you're growing, the history on your field for that crop, and then whatever you do after that would be measured against that. Now, if for instance you grow a crop that has never been grown there before, then they would look around to some fields that are basically the same soils, similar, and that's what they would base it on. I believe that's the Water Conservation Advisory Board's method that they have approved.
Now, what about us that have had conservation in for long before QSA? Now, are we going to get credit for that, or did we get knocked out of that by our illustrious dream team?
I believe that the latest I understood, yeah, there will be no credit for previous efforts that were done.
No, but not credit, but if we're using it now, if our neighbor is getting, say, 6 feet, and they don't have a pump back, and now they put a crop in, and they can, get allowing an acre foot to go back to whatever conservation, and I've had that in. Do I get the 6 feet for growing the same crop?
No, that's not the way it's been set up. And so, but there is a discussion about, well, what can we do to not disincentivize you to keep doing that? And so I'm not sure yet where we are on that, but that's still under discussion, because that is a big issue. And I don't know what the solution is yet, but they're talking about it. So.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Okay, we'll turn it back to Jesse and Chuck then.
Well, thank you very much for being here tonight. Appreciate your time. We're going to be in Calexico tomorrow at the same time, 5 p.m. at the City Hall. I believe that's where we're going to be at. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Chuck.
You're welcome.